All right, so day 5 here. If we're taking a look at it, why is this thing not letting me edit? Is my keyboard working? So we are going to take a look at, we're going to describe the components of the human movement system and how that human movement system sort of works the way it's supposed to produce movement and learn movement and all of that. So after this presentation, the biggest things we want to understand are these kind of important concepts. We want to understand how our muscles generate the proper amount of muscular force. We want to understand what are called length tension relationships, which is basically how your muscles sit at the appropriate length. What we call a force velocity curve. So we're going to talk about like how your muscles are going to produce different amounts of force depending on where they are in their contraction. Force couple relationships, which is basically how muscles work together. Muscle leverage and arthrokinematics, like those two things are where we are basically going to look at the different types of levers in your body. Luckily, we're not going to make you guys analyze levers in this kinesiology class, just because like there's a lot of like mathematics involved and things like that. But I do kind of want to show you like, you know, what those levers actually do look like, just so you can get kind of a general idea of, you know, if you've ever wondered why you can go and bench like a bunch of weight versus like you do a lateral raise. I mean, look at the difference between, you know, the amount of weight that you can use on a lateral raise versus the amount of weight that you can use during like a bench press or something. Drastically different. And that's because there are different types of levers, and there's a little bit of different sort of advantages to moving your body in one way or another, which is why we know it's designed to move the way it is. Or if you think about like the difference between your chest press weight versus your chest fly weight, those two things are very, very different, you know, and that all has to do with levers and torque and stuff. So we'll take a look at that. And then at the end, we will get into developing motor behavior, motor control, and motor learning, which is really how we actually do kind of learn all this stuff. And it's why NASM has created the OPT model the way they have, because the idea is that we want to set our clients up for, you know, the best way to sort of learn new movements and stuff. So, so looking at it again, introing, or just starting off with something here, you know, our human movement system has to be able to, it has to be aware of its relationship to the environment. So again, that kind of comes back to the idea of our proprioception, right? Like our human movement system has to have proprioception. Thanks to our nervous system, you know, working with our muscular and skeletal system, it gets information in, and then it uses that information to sort of interpret where it is and how it's moving and things like that, right? And so like, that's a really big, important part of movement. If we have bad information coming in, well, then we are going to have bad responses, you know, just like if, you know, if you asked me, like if I was your financial advisor, right? And you were like, hey, how much money do I have in the bank account? And I was like, oh, you've got tons, right? And you're like, great, well, put it all in Apple stock, you know? And I literally put like all of it in there, you know, like you might end up like overdrafting your bank account. And it's like, I thought you said I had tons. I was like, yeah, you had like 20 bucks in there. And it's like, it's like, that is not tons. Like we are working with different definitions of what tons means, you know? So when you're working with bad information, like you're going to make bad, you know, responses to that information, right? And that's how your human movement system is. You know, if your brain thinks that, you know, if you've got a muscle that's telling your brain, oh no, this muscle couldn't possibly stretch any further, well, then your brain's going to go, oh, well, I guess I should probably back off then and you know, relax a little. So it has to be able to gather the necessary information regarding its environments, right? And then use that to produce the appropriate responses rather than, you know, sort of inappropriate ones, I guess. So the idea here, when we're talking about like our muscles and stuff, right? The idea about muscles is that generally they contract one way, right? Like a contraction is the concentric part of a movement, right? Remember from Friday, we were talking about the differences between concentric contractions, eccentric contractions, and isometric contractions, right? Traditionally, the way people see things is like, oh, my muscles squeeze and then they relax back the other way, which is, you know, and True, like that is what muscles do. They can pull and then they can relax back to full length. Um, but that relaxing action is actually a type of contraction, which we have to remember, right? Like eccentric contractions are contractions. They're just contractions for a lower amount of force than whatever it is they're resisting against. So if this, lacrosse ball weighs 1 pound, right? And I contract for more than 1 pound of force, I'm going to overcome it and be able to manipulate it and move it around the room. But if this thing was made of like some alien material that weighs 500 pounds, right, it's going to, I'm not going to be able to contract for a greater amount of force than the resistance. I'm going to try, let's say I'm trying to lift it and, but it isn't able to like move. Well, that's the other type of contraction too, right? Like if I've got like, if it weighs 500 pounds, I'm trying to get it off the ground, but I can't lift it, right? And I'm just contracting, but I'm not really moving. Well, that would be what we call an isometric. Even though I'm trying to produce a greater amount of force, if it's not happening, all I'm doing is isometrically contracting, or if it, and if it's lowering me to the ground, then I'm eccentrically contracting. So that's oftentimes how we think of our muscles. We really just think of them as like squeezing, but that's a very traditional perception. And this is kind of a word actually that you'll see throughout your NASM text, where it's like the traditional perception or the traditional take on this or the traditional, viewpoint. And I know, like, I love certain traditions, a lot of times we associate the word traditional with meaning like, oh yeah, that's how we've always done things, therefore it's good. But we got to kind of remember that like the fitness industry is not always the, full of the best information, like, or at least it hasn't, because it started, if you read your first chapter of your NASM, and there's really not like the most lesson worthy stuff in that chapter. It's really just kind of, hey, welcome to NASM, but it does kind of start off with a little bit of the history of gyms. And it's like, look, gyms started by just like people who were in shape because maybe they had good genetics or, maybe they had like worked out pretty hard and stuff. Just telling other people what to do based on like what worked for them. And that's not really the best approach because everybody's so different, and so like the traditional take on things wasn't really the most scientifically effective. And then we started studying this stuff and putting more effort in, and now we are where we are. But this is one of those things where it's like the traditional perception of like only working concentrically, not really the best way to look at muscles. We know that they work in all three different directions, right? And the other part of it is like we used to think that muscles predominantly work in one plane, but really like, we know that muscles work together. And this is why like I don't hate isolation movements. If you're trying to get your shoulders to pop or something, and get them in like, get them to look really good and stuff like that, or you need to like pick up the strength. Yeah, isolation moves are great. They're a good way to kind of make up for that. But they're not the only thing. You look at like a lot of traditional workouts and it's like, oh, you need to strengthen your legs, go hit the leg extension machine, go hit the hamstring curl machine, go hit the calf press, and go hit that glute kickback machine. And it's like, yes, you can do that. And I don't necessarily hate those machines either, guys. But is that the best way to actually like develop your nervous system and your brain and how we're supposed to move and stuff? Not really, right? It's a very traditional take on things. So NASM is going to say, you're going to hear this word all the time, whenever they say like traditional, they'll say, but the functional viewpoint or the integrated viewpoint, and that's how those two words are what NASM wants to be. NASM wants to be an integrated functional take on exercise. It's imperative that we sort of look at the fact that like muscles move through all planes of motions. Again, your bicep, yeah, it moves through the sagittal plane this way, right? Whenever it's like contracting, there's my sagittal bicep curl, right? But it also does transverse movement, right? It does pronation and supination of my wrist. So that's 2 planes of motion right there. And it has to work through the entire contraction spectrum. My bicep needs to be able to shorten, it needs to lengthen, and it needs to be able to stabilize. So that is why we have to sort of look at things. And this is what I was talking about earlier. This is my soapboxy lecture today, where I'm like, traditional workouts bad, NASM workouts good. So I will try not to do any more ranting, and we'll go ahead and move forward here. So looking at the idea of force, right? I sure wish that this said it was a magical thing that binds the universe together, because I love Star Wars. But no, force is going to be defined as any influence that's applied to another object, which either accelerates or decelerates that second object. So basically, it's the interaction between two entities that either accelerates it or decelerates it. So when my bicep contracts for a greater amount of force than something else, then it will accelerate that something else. It will accelerate that object by concentrically contracting. But when my muscles lengthen, let's say my bicep is eccentrically contracting, well, that is actually going to reduce the force of something else, right? So if my bicep is eccentrically contracting, that's going this way, right? So imagine if something was falling and I grabbed it, right? And it kind of like lengthened out my bicep like this. That other object is going to slow down as I sort of like catch it as it's going by, right? That is an eccentric deceleration. And that's sort of the way we want to start speaking. We want to think of we want to kind of like pair the two words together. It's almost like they kind of roll off your tongue, one right after the other. There's concentric acceleration of certain objects, and there's eccentric deceleration of objects. Or you can think of it as like concentric shortening of objects or eccentric lengthening, right? So as I'm descending into a squat, let's say I'm standing and then I take the squat down, I'm eccentrically lengthening or eccentrically decelerating with my glute muscles and my quads and my hamstrings, right? As I'm sitting into the bottom of that squat, I'm decelerating on the way down and my muscles are being lengthened out. And then as I want to overcome that force and concentrically accelerate, come out of my squat, I'm going to concentrically shorten, I'm going to concentrically accelerate using my agonist muscles, right? And so that's how I'm going to sort of do this, right? My muscles are going to contract for a greater amount of force. If I got 225 pounds on my back, whoop, and I create 226 pounds of force, I'll be able to overcome it. And so that's what we're doing. That's sort of what we're looking at today. We're going to look at how we are able to do this the way we're really meant to move. We are looking at human movement. So I would say, here's the thing. All of this stuff we're talking about today is, objectively, it is very important. I'm not saying any of this is more important than others, except I kind of am. I would say the most important thing of today's lesson is right here. This concept right here, the idea of a length tension relationship is, I would say, really the staple of our jobs. Now me or Eddie, we haven't actually talked about this because we haven't come to it in our lessons just yet, but Thomas will tell you, I usually like to break down personal training or any problem solving into three things. Any problem in your life, can be sort of worked out with this sort of three-step process that I am absolutely obsessed with. First is you have to identify what's going on. You need to gather data to formulate a diagnosis, and then step two, you need to basically solve using that data, the problem, for instance, oh, I can't pay my rent, right? That's a problem. Now you've analyzed it. And it's because I've got more money going out than I've got money coming in. And then you need to solve that problem. It's okay, well, I need to, and you look at your finances I spent $50 on coffee this week. I spent this on this. Oh, and also I need to make more money, which the last part is probably the most important, right? And so now you've got a solution. So now you just need to implement that solution. So you get on Indeed.com, you start looking for a higher paying job. Hopefully I imagine that's what kind of led you guys to Sochi. Because personal trainers, we make a pretty good salary, so I imagine you guys have actually kind of gone through this process a little bit, right? But that third step, that's the implementation. So if you look at this in personal training, it's you had a client who comes to you and they're I got low back pain and I don't really know what's going on. It's all right, well, let's identify what's going on. So you do a movement assessment, you look at their posture and you're ooh, yeah, you're definitely moving this way. And that's not how we're meant to move. So because you're moving this way, let's say it's a posterior pelvic tilt, right? They got a low back rounding situation, which is pretty rare, but let's say that's the problem. They got a flat back, right? Or a flat spine. And it's like, okay, well, now I know what's going on. I've identified the problem in step one. Step two, right? I got to look at how to fix that, how to solve this problem. What causes low back rounding? Oh, tight hamstrings, weak glute muscles, and weak low back muscles, and overly developed spinal movers on the front. So the abs are actually a little too tight. The hamstrings are a little bit too tight. I got to stretch those muscles out. So we're going to do things like cobras, right? And then we're going to do things like glute bridges, which is going to strengthen the glutes. We're going to do hamstring stretches, right? So now I've sort of like written a little tiny program. It's not like a full workout or anything, but I've sort of like come up with my solution. That's step two. I solved the problem. Not in the traditional sense of like the problem is over, but I have developed the solution, right? Now I just need to implement that solution. Step three, I'm going to start training my client, right? So that's really what this job is. It's, you know, at least in an advanced perspective, it's not just, you know, don't get me wrong. I know plenty of trainers who can make a lot of money just walking into a gym. They write out a good program one day and they just put everybody through it all the time. Same program, everybody. And they do well. They like financially, like I get it. You know, if you're a charismatic enough person, you got enough energy, you draw people into you, you can do fine that way. But if you want to be a freaking great trainer, that is where, like, you know, we do look at the posture stuff. We're much more advanced than that. And really that posture stuff, how do you know which muscles are which? Well, again, tying that three-step concept to this concept right here, that is coming from our understanding of what are called length tension relationships. So what a length tension relationship is, it is the resting length of a muscle and the amount of tension that that muscle can produce at that resting length. So basically every muscle you've got has an ideal position that it's supposed to be resting in. And when it's outside of that ideal, then it's not going to be as strong as it's supposed to be, right? Just like, you know, LeBron James has got certain places on the court that he's probably better at hitting, you know, hitting a basket from than other parts. You know what I mean? Like, he's a great shot. Particularly he's really good. Like, you know, if you look at like where he's the best at like hitting threes, always in the corners, right? He loves those like corner shots. Absolutely kills it, you know? And he's also great at like, you know, kind of driving and stuff, but like just looking at the places he's best at shooting for the core from. So if I know that, then as his coach, I'm gonna be like, all right, well, we're gonna run plays that are gonna get you to these spots because those are where you're best at, like, you know, hitting buckets. So that's you know, his ideal spots, right? The same thing is true of your muscles. Your muscles have sort of an ideal resting length where they're at their strongest. And the reason for that, we can actually get even a little bit more scientific about it. If we go back to our sort of microanatomy, you know, it is where, rather than just sort of looking at like, you know, this position of your muscles being the strongest, if we look at what's going on in, you know, we really zoom in here, it's the greatest degree of overlap between those actin and those myosin fibers, right? So remember, we talked about the sliding action in the sliding filament model, where the actin and the myosin are contracting, and so that causes the filaments to kind of slide together. So what do you think is going to happen if a muscle is already slid together and then you need to contract that muscle? It's got nowhere to go, right? Like, it's just not going to be a very strong contraction. So that muscle is actually going to be weaker than it's supposed to be. Or what do you think is going to happen if, you know, the fibers are pulled so far apart they can barely get a grip? Like, if I had to grab another human being and I had to hold them with just my freaking index finger and like their index finger, and I'm trying to pull them, you know, up, you know, it's like a dramatic scene in a movie. They're falling over a cliff and I got them by one finger. You think I'm going to actually pull them up over that cliff? Probably not. that person's going down, you know, like, because this is not that strong. Like, I don't have a good grip, you know what I mean? Yeah. That's what we call an underactive muscle. That is a muscle that is not as strong as it's supposed to be. So we're seeing like this length tension relationship. It is an example of, like, it's one of the reasons why we zoomed in so far, you know. Yeah, like, Thomas, you've heard this before, but like, again, Eddie and me, you guys are new, right? Like, you gotta be like, there had to be at least 1 second, one moment of like, man, we're really getting deep on this muscle stuff. Like, it's like we're really zoomed in on these cells. I don't know what this has to do with lifting weights in the gym, right? This is what it has to do. This is where it's coming from. Like I said, the small sort of represents the big, you know. So it is the greatest degree of overlap between those actin and those myosin fibers. If you lengthen a muscle beyond its optimal resting length, which we're actually seeing here, right? This is sort of ideal here, right? And this red line represents the amount of tension that this muscle can generate. And so or the amount of force that it can generate. So this is where, you know, it can produce the greatest amount of force. And so like you can see here, this is less force, and over here, this is also less force, right? Like the red line is, you know, the amount of force is over here, and this is the length of those fibers. So there's plenty of room to contract those fibers here. And here, there's not very much room. They're already contracted. There's just not a lot of room to slide. So the amount of force, the red line, is pretty low on this axis right here, right? So that's a weaker fiber than it's supposed to be. Or over here, look, there's plenty of room to move, but unfortunately, there's not a very much overlap between the blue and the red. So that's also weaker than it's supposed to be. A better version of that picture is right here. So lengthening a muscle beyond its optimal resting length will result in force reduction, right? A weaker fiber. And guess what? Shortening a muscle beyond its optimal resting length will also result in force reduction. So a lot of times when I'm describing this concept, I will be really reductive. If I'm talking to a client, and by the way, guys, you can do this. Don't be afraid. Like, it's okay to talk to your clients and reduce the information. You don't have to like get really deep like we are getting right now. A lot of times when I'm talking to my clients, I'm like, look, the reason your posture isn't sort of like, the reason you've got these aches and pains is you've got one muscle that's too strong and you got one muscle that's too weak. One muscle that's pulling too much and one that's not pulling enough. And that's a very, very reductive way to describe it. It's very oversimplified. But for your clients, it works. But it's not actually scientifically very accurate, because take a look right here. Let's go ahead and put this over here, and then we'll sort of, okay, that's a little bit too much zoomed in. Let's see here. Let's go like this. So you can actually see, right? If I zoom in, right, here is a muscle, like there's the actin and the myosin, right? There's the actin strand, that's the thin one. And then there's the myosin strand, that's the thick one, right? And you can see they just really aren't crossed over that much. Like there's a good, I mean, there's a little bit, like obviously like these guys can get a grip, but like see this fiber right here, it's got nothing to grab, right? This fiber here's got nothing to grab, right? There's just not an ideal amount of like overlap between these two fibers. It's sort of lengthened out beyond what would make it strong. Versus here in the middle, you can see there's plenty of overlap, right? This has got a good grip, this has got a good grip, they all got a good grip, which means it's going to be easy for them to pull, towards the center there, right? So this is a normal resting length. So this muscle here is overly lengthened, but this one's great. This is exactly kind of where it's supposed to be. And then over here, we have the sort of opposite problem, right? Look at here. You can see they're already crossing over one another. The actin strands are actually already bunched up. This is an overactive or shortened muscle. So now if you look at like someone with altered posture, if we take a look here, let's say we see somebody who has what's called lower cross syndrome. This is sort of the opposite of what I was describing earlier with the flat back. This is somebody who has, you can see too much low back curvature, right? And it'll sort of manifest itself sort of in two ways, right? We see like this version here, which I call this Instagram booty, where they're just like sticking their butt out like way too much and like overarching their back. That's going to cause like low back pain. The hips are basically being pulled downward. You can kind of see this angle here versus here, it's like relatively flat. And then here it's like way too flat. This is that low back rounding that I talked about. Both of these are not great, you know? This actually doesn't look necessarily that. This is sometimes what people think. They're like, oh, this is good posture. It's like, I'm giving you what you want. It's like, actually, you're kind of going beyond what I actually want. So we call that lower cross syndrome, and it's the anterior pelvic tilt, right? You can see here, this is the sort of a sway back posture. It's actually the same thing. Very, 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 or at least it's the same muscles are causing it. And so like, that's definitely not great. So if we look at the muscles here, here's kind of a zoomed in version of the picture, paying attention to the one that's on the left here, in particular, this is that lower cross syndrome. This is where, you know, if you think of your pelvis as a sort of a steering wheel in terms of like how it's able to rotate, your pelvis can, it can go this way, right? And it can go this way. And so it can do this kind of rotational movement. And so in this version on the left side of your screen, you can see the erector spinae, which does pull this way, right? It grabs the back of your pelvis. It's your low back muscles, right? It grabs the top of your pelvis here and it pulls it up, right? And meanwhile, your hip flexor muscles, which are also in charge of this, well, they pull your pelvis down. So they pull this way. So now if you've got something attached in the front that's pulling down and something attached in the back that's pulling up, you do it at the same time, well, there you go. There's your Instagram booty, right? And you can see I've got this like downward slope to my pelvis now. So if I'm walking around with this overly arched low back all day, I'm going to eventually end up like grinding my spinal discs in the front, all right? Well, in the back. And that's going to gap my spinal discs in the front. And that's eventually going to lead to some type of problem, you know? So those are the tight muscles in this situation, the hip flexors and the erector spinae. It's too much low back arching, which by the way, I actually have a little bit of this version, this low back flattening, this low back rounding. So it's actually quite difficult for me to show low back arching because it's sort of the opposite spectrum of where I'm at. But here, this is also a problem, right? You can see here, this is sort of the opposite. This is a posterior pelvic tilt, right? So this is an anterior pelvic tilt. The pelvis is tilting towards the front, anterior. Posterior pelvic tilt, the pelvis is tilting towards the back, posterior. And that is actually where we basically just flip this around, right? You see this one's pulling up in the back and down in the front. Well, what if we were pulling down in the back and up in the front? We just flip that around. That's the posterior tilt. It causes this to rotate this way. So that's the hamstring muscles pulling down and the abdominal muscles pulling up. Oop, hold on 1 second, guys. That is a Sochi call. I normally don't like to interrupt for my phone, but give me 1 second. That's just making sure there's not like an emergency or something. Okay. It's probably gonna get a reply, but okay. So you can see sort of the opposite here, right? This one's pulling up and down, this one's pulling down, and this one's pulling up. So they're sort of flipped. And you can even see the discs, right? See the spinal disc, how this one's gapping in the front, and this one's like kind of collapsed in the front, right? This would actually be gapping in the back if it could gap, but it actually can't. It just further grinds. So both are really bad. They're just not great for your spine. We'll talk more about this on hip day, which is, let's see, we got foot and ankle on Wednesday. Yeah, so we'll talk about this on Friday. But that's an example of overactive versus underactive, right? We're seeing where some muscles are not contracting ways, but so earlier I said that, like, you know, an easy way to describe this to your client is you got one muscle that's too strong, you got another muscle that's one muscle that's too weak, you know. That is an oversimplification for sure, right? You know, what's actually happening, what is accurate, is you got two muscles that are too weak. You know, that overly shortened muscle is still weaker than it's supposed to be. Yes, it is contracting for a greater amount of force. It is concentrically shortened, and the underactive muscle is eccentrically lengthened. So yeah, that description kind of works, but in reality, guys, both muscles are too weak. You know, like me, I've got the posterior pelvic tilt. My hamstrings are contracting more than they're supposed to. So there could be an argument if I wanted to be like complimentary to myself, I could say, oh, I've got overly developed hamstrings. And it's like, yeah, that's a bad thing. Like, yeah, what I really have are hamstrings that won't relax. So overactive doesn't directly translate to mean strong. What it really translates to is it's a nervous system that won't stop contracting those muscles, right? When it should. It's like, hey, man, take a day off, relax, let go, you know? And then that'll be a stronger muscle. So, so that's really important, because here's the other next sort of big concept. One of the things that we also have to look at is what's called your force velocity curve. So a force velocity curve, it is the ability of the muscles to produce force with an increasing amount of velocity. So the more concentric you get, the less ability to create a concentric contraction you're going to have, right? So if we go back to this like length tension relationship, I pull up a picture of this here. This is what we're seeing, right? This is we're seeing the sarcomere of our muscle fibers, right? So this is ideal. This is perfect, right? There's a good amount of overlap, but not too much overlap. So the muscle is as strong as it's going to get. And then we start to lose a little bit of strength when they're a little overly lapped. And then over here, we lose a lot of strength, right? This is, you know, let's say you can lift, let's say your 1 rep max is 100 pounds, right? So here you go. Now you can lift 100 pounds, but now you've overshortened the muscle. So maybe you can only lift, you know, 90 pounds, right? You lost 10% of your strength. Down here, it's like now you can only lift like 80 pounds, right? So you lost 20% of your strength because you overshortened the muscle fibers, right? And then over here, the same thing is true, right? 80%, 20%, right? Those are overly lengthened muscle fibers, right? You can see here, they barely get in a grip. And then here, it's like practically not touching at all. So now if I've got like a muscle over here that's pulling too much, that's going to cause the muscle over here to not be able to pull enough. And I'm going to have sort of an overactive, underactive muscle situation, which is going to look like this, right? I'm going to have one fiber that, you know, both of these aren't resting ideally. They're not as strong as their potential. This one's weaker, but this one's pulling too much and this one's pulling too little. And that is going to shift this next big concept, the force velocity curve. Okay, that's going to shift this. But not quite the picture I want. All right, we'll just use the NASA one. And I like it when it's actually flipped upside down, but I can never like find it. I wish the axes of like force and velocity were flipped. And I can sometimes find that curve, but nobody else likes to teach it that way. So it's always hard for me to like Google. But here you go. You can actually see this kind of dips in these two directions. So on the left, this is representing your muscle's force. So think of this as how much weight you can lift, right? And over here, this is the velocity of contraction. Think of this as how fast you can lift that contraction, right? So this overall together, force and velocity, represents your overall power output. You know, just like imagine if you were able to cover, you know, 1 foot's distance with every step. So every time you take a step, you cover 1 foot, and you're able to take 10 steps per second, right? Well, then that means you're going to cover 10 feet every second. It's pretty fast, right? That is trekking. You are, Usain Bolt here. But if you can only cover 6 inches with every step, and you're only able to take, but you're still able to take maybe 10 steps per second. Well, because you're covering half the distance, now you're only traveling 5 feet per second, right? So that's a substantial. You lost 50% of your power just by shortening the distance. Or, if you step slower, if you're covering 1 foot per step, but you were only stepping, 1 time a second, right? Well, you just cut it down by 90%. You just lost, you're down to 10% of your original power output. So that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at the power output of our muscles. And so when something is very high force, it's going to lose velocity. Which makes a lot of sense. You think about it, right? Like, think about how fast you can throw a baseball versus how fast you can throw a freaking bowling ball, right? I can't throw a bowling, that thing weighs, 12 pounds. Baseball weighs what, less than 1? So it's a lot easier. But now it can go too far in the other direction. Think about how fast you could throw a ball of tissue paper. Well, that freaking thing is going to be way too low in terms of force. So it's not going to move through the air, and the air is just going to cause it to go, and it's just going to fall, right? So there is sort of an ideal spot. There's kind of an ideal spot in the middle that we're looking for. And then, that's the thing. Like, the high amount of force, you're going to have low velocity. Low amount of force, you can have lots of velocity. But the overall power output is going to be decreased in both versions. So there's sort of an ideal middle here. And this is actually why when we're training for being explosive, when we're training for power, I talk to people all the time. They're like trying to learn how to dunk basketballs. And they're like, I do these squat jumps all the time, and I'm just not improving my vert. And I'm like, well, here's the thing. You're working on half of the equation. Take a look right here. That person's working on low force because body weight, just like squat jumps, right? And high velocity. They're explosively jumping, but that's only half the equation for dunking a basketball. We have to have the other half of the equation, which is the high force. I'm like, you know what you need to do? Go get a freaking barbell on your back. Don't do squat jumps or anything, but like throw that barbell on there and start lifting heavy. And it's like, really? Because I've seen people lift heavy and it looks like this, they get that barbell and they're like, and then they're like, oh my God. And it's like slow. It's like, that's going to make me jump faster. And it's like, yes, because it is teaching you the other half of the power equation. You're getting the really heavy concentric part of it. And so when they come together, you get, increased power output. And that's why this force velocity curve is kind of important to look at, right? So here's the thing. The more you eccentrically lengthen out your muscle, the more room it's got to crawl concentrically, right? I mean, don't get me wrong, we don't want to overly lengthen it. But if we look at that, like, length tension relationship here, we go back to this, we go back 1 slide, right? If I were to lengthen out my muscle like this, and now I've got all this room to move, and let's say it's, my nervous system can immediately contract this the way it's supposed to. Well, now if I go from here to here, that's a big contraction, right? That's all the actin and the myosin all like crawling over one another, making a really strong contraction. So if we are looking and we're analyzing this, it's like, oh, okay, so what I need to do is I need to load the gun. I need to lengthen my muscle first so that I can really have plenty of room to shorten it, right? Just like, if you were trying to like picture like a Spider-Man movie where he's like, they've done this in a couple of them, right? Where he's like thinking about jumping off a building. He's like learning his spider powers, right? Like he goes to the edge of a building and he's like, I'm not going to jump from here. And then he goes all, he runs back there, gets a big run up and then, right? That's what we're doing when we lengthen out our muscles so we can get a big contraction in the other direction. So that is where, we need an eccentric lengthening in our muscle first so that we can have a big concentric shortening in our muscle second, right? That's what we need for strong contractions. Now, there's actually a term for this. Oh shoot. And actually so summarizing, because I was supposed to go this slide a second ago. As the velocity of a concentric contraction increases, its ability to produce force will decrease. So the more fibers that get overlapped, eventually it's going to lose its ability to overlap any more fibers. Therefore, its ability to produce force is going to decrease. The more shortened it gets, the less force it's going to be able to create. This is actually kind of why when you're lifting, sometimes you start to get to the end of the lift, you're like, it's just sometimes hard to kind of just finish off that last little bit. It's like, makes sense, right? Everything's already shortened. Like, it's hard to move it the rest of the way. So overlapping your actin filament interferes with its ability to make more bridges, right? More overlaps, because eventually there's just no binding sites available and there's no more, everybody's already working. But as the velocity of the eccentric part increases, its ability to produce force also increases, right? Like as you are lengthening out your fibers, it's like, oh, you're giving yourself more room to have a run up, you're backing up, getting ready to jump off that building. So that is very evident, very, very evident during our next concept, which is right here, called a stretch shortening cycle. Okay, so what a stretch shortening cycle is, you can see they kind of, it's honestly like the cycle is almost in the way they named this, right? You stretch so that you can then shorten. I lengthen a muscle so that I can snap it back the other way. It's like a rubber band, right? Stretch, and then I let it go, and it shortens, which flies it off my finger, right? And it's a cycle. It can kind of repeat over and over and over again. So it describes how a rapid eccentric contraction, a rapid lengthening of a muscle fiber eccentrically, can cause it to want to snap back in the other direction in a much more powerful, very rapid concentric way. So the best example of this that I can always think of, and I know I pull this video up all the time, but if we look at, speaking of Spider-Man, if we look at my YouTube suggestions, let's see here.
They're listening to you, man.
Yeah, right. God dang it, where is it? NFL Combine high jump. So the best example of this that I can think of is the NFL Combine's vertical jump. You can see a really great example of stretch shortening happening in real time here, right? So you'll notice they always do the same thing.
Dang, you're so high.
Right? Oh, it's crazy. Yeah. I mean, they're trained, right? They're not just trained like, because this is the thing. There's Paris Campbell. They only get they only get this one chance to be in the combine. Like they don't get multiple tryouts. I mean, they do, but like this is like the big day. So like they have coaches who are literally just high jump coaches who are just teaching them how to do this exactly properly. So I'm going to play this in slow motion.
It is.
Let's go. Yeah. So watch this. What you're going to see is he is going to take his arms up like this. And then he's going to throw his arms down a couple different times, usually. Oh, no, he just did it once. But he threw his arms down, right? And then he jumped. And the reason he did that is because, again, like, let's go back here. So he's going to throw his arms really forcefully down. When he does that, the reason he's doing that is because now, boom, I'm going to pause this. The glutes, which is the main jumper muscle, this is stretched out now. His hamstrings, they're stretched out. His quads, they're stretched out. Even his calves, right? His knees are, coming over and past his toes, right? This is stretched out. Every one of those muscles just experienced eccentric lengthening, which means he took the rubber band and stretched it out like this. And now there's all this tension in the rubber band that wants to explode in the other direction. So what's funny is the faster he does this rapid eccentric lengthening, the faster he's going to be able to do this big concentric shortening. And there he goes. It looks like he's freaking flying, right? He's got a 40-inch vert, which is not the most impressive in the NFL, but like, it's not bad. It's more than I can do.
Guys have one of those, what are those called? The thing that he's touching when he jumps?
Oh, I honestly can't remember what it's called. It's just it's a vertical jump tester.
Vertical jump stick. Okay. You have one of those at the school or no?
Ugh, man, no. All right. No. So here's the thing. So Sochi's never had a chance like officially to buy one or anything. I would love it if we did.
I'll find them on Amazon, bro. I'll bring it with me.
They're not actually that bad. Vertical jump.
We're gonna be jumping in class and shit.
Yeah, why not?
Oh God, actually, I guess they're $400. That's crazy. That is expensive.
Okay, I'll steal one.
That's more expensive than I thought. That's the thing. They know okay, there's one that's 175. Like they can charge for it because they know, like, well, if you want it, then clearly you're gonna pay for it. Here's what sucks, guys. This is a true freaking story. So I used to work at Biggest Losers Resort. It was somewhat connected to the NBC show, but it wasn't like super connected. That partnership split. I used to work for this other weight loss resort afterwards that sort of started without Biggest Loser around. But it was still on the same property. And so NBC knew about this property. So they wanted to start a new reality show that wasn't around like obese people getting fit. It was around like average Joes becoming like Olympic CrossFit, amazing athletes, right? And it was called Strong, and it was produced by Sylvester Stallone. So this was Strong, right? It was this, reality TV series all about, there's the celebrity trainers. And it was all about like teaching them how to become super athletes. And it was shot on the same property. It was kind of a flop. Nobody cared about it. And it was on the same property that I used to work on. And we would, interact with them all the time. And like, they would sometimes borrow our equipment and, and stuff. And we'd interact with their guests and this and that. And then they just left because that's what Hollywood does. They got all the money in the world. So they're like, and they just built this whole gym and they just left it all there. And I was like, and myself and all the other trainers were like, we went in there. We snatched as much stuff as we could. That is how I have like my medicine balls, my kettlebells, like my battle rope. Like I got all of it from that show. I actually took a bunch of cones. Like I was like, guys, you have cones. These big ass complicated, things. Not the cones you've seen, Thomas, but other ones that I have. They actually still have the logo on them. I don't bring those to class, but all this stuff. And they had a vertical jump tester. And I was like, how do I get this in my car? And I couldn't get it in my car at the time. And I left it there.
Man.
This was years ago. And I was like, oh man, I think about it every time I teach like a show this in class. I'm like, I should have taken that freaking somewhere.
Yeah.
But it would have just been in my apartment. It was like years. It was just like, why do you have this in your living room?
The neighbors downstairs would complain on you every single day.
Yeah, right. Oh yeah, I was jumping. Yeah. God. So anyway, that is. I had a chance to have one of those. Long story, still quite long. All right, so a stretch shortening cycle. So here's the thing. If you want to be able to jump high, you need to properly load, you need to properly cock the gun. You know what I mean? That's where we have to understand our stretch shortening cycles. And you will not be able to do that if your muscle is already shortened or if another muscle is overly lengthened. If both of those things are true, or even one of those things are true, you're going to lose force. You're not going to be as strong as you're supposed to be. This is actually why sprinters, they start in that position where they're like down on the ground. They're lengthened so they can have this big explosive, shortening, and that can sort of kick them off. And then they can kind of carry that momentum through the rest of the race. You'll notice they don't do that in a marathon. They're all just kind of standing around because like at that point, it doesn't really matter. It's not 4 hours for professionals, but it's like a 2.5 hour run. You know what I mean? Like, they're not really worried about that big explosive start. So here's the thing. If we know that we need to have like proper force velocity curves, which is going to influence our stretch shortening cycle, one of the things we got to kind of tie this whole concept to is the idea of like what a force couple is. Okay. And a force couple is not, I'm not talking about like Kim and Kanye, although that, or Jay-Z and B, that's a force couple. That's my favorite dumb joke, by the way. I say that, I have other favorite dumb jokes, but no, a force couple, it's multiple muscles working together. Okay. So like the way that your glutes and your hamstrings both contract during a squat, that's a force couple, right? They're synergists to one another. The classic example of this is your rotator cuff, or at least your shoulder blade. This isn't even necessarily your rotator cuff, but if you look here and you see like your scapula, right? You've got your upper trapezius muscles right here attached to the top. You've got your middle trapezius here attached in the middle. And you got your lower trapezius here attached on the bottom. And you get your serratus anterior attached on the inside, wrapping around your body, coming to the front. Those little, fillet muscles underneath your pecs. So all of those are working together. As I move my arm through a range of motion like this, my scapula's got to be able to swing out and round around the body, kind of like that. It kind of makes this like swinging action like that, right? That's what your scapula does every time you sort of move through these wide ranges of motion. So one muscle's got to be able to lengthen, and another one muscle's got to be able to shorten, and another muscle's got to sort of stabilize. They all got to kind of work together. So it's the synergistic action of these muscles. So this is how I like to put it. It is how our muscles work together to produce movement surrounding a joint. The agonist will concentrically contract along with the synergist. Both of those will shorten. Meanwhile, the antagonist will stabilize by contracting in the opposite direction. I know that I described it as Batman versus the Joker when we first learned agonist and antagonist, but they really are supposed to actually work together. We don't want one pulling more than the other. We want them to kind of both pull a little bit to stabilize the area, just like if you were, raising like a wall or a barn or something, you'd pull with the rope on one side, but you wouldn't just not have anything the other way, because then you would just and it would fall the other way, right? You'd pull on both sides, right? That creates stability. That's the agonist-antagonist relationship we want to have. The antagonist will stabilize in the opposite direction, and then the stabilizers will sort of create a more isometric stabilizing in the entire area. So that's really what's happening during force couples. So there's a lot of really common force couples you're going to see. You've got your obliques, both internal and external. Your internal obliques are facing one way. Your external obliques, they kind of cross over your muscles like this. They create this kind of X, and that way I can twist one way and I can twist back the other way, right? So those muscles are sort of sort of crossing over one another. And what's funny is my internal will contract to bring me this way, while the other side internal will relax, and my external will relax, and my external will contract, right? And then the exact opposite is true going the other way. So those are all force couples, right? Or your trapezius muscles during your scapula, the one we looked at in the picture. Your glutes, quads, and calves all working together for running or walking, right? Your calf muscles working together to kind of, drive you up or during a jump or also during walking. Your deltoid and your rotator cuff, right? All these muscles are all sort of force couples. They're all sort of working together. So big concept. Like I said, all of this is important, but for now, let's take a quick little pause here. Any questions or comments? How you guys feeling so far?
I feel good.
Pretty good. So what is I do have a question. So what about let's say a weighted pull-up, or even a weighted jump squat, or let's say you're doing a barbell jump squat or something like that.
Sure.
Obviously you're adding weight.
Yep.
And then you notice let's say you're trying to burn out, and then you do it just body weight and you feel lighter.
Yeah.
So what's really happening right there? I mean, as you were talking about that, that kind of reminded me of the whole thing. Yeah.
That's a really cool.
And it's only for a short amount of time too, because then afterwards, once you already use the rest of the energy, I feel maybe the muscle fibers ended up stretching, then they went back.
Yeah.
To the point where you can't do that anymore until you start lifting something heavy.
Yeah, you do the heavy lifts, and you strip all the weight off, and you do some explosive lifts afterwards. And you're oh, I feel like I'm a million lighter, and you feel you're higher, right? Mm-hmm. So the reason I think this question is so cool is because honestly, I'm tempted to say, hey, Thomas, explain this for me. Right? This is describing our power OPT. This is exactly what we do, Eddie, in what is called phase 5 of your training.
Oh, okay.
And we were just talking about this in the last mod, just before you guys joined us. So we will get into this at the end of this mod, actually. But what you're describing is what's called a contrast set.
Mhm.
There's like a big amount of contrast between the amount of weight you're using in both sets. Very, very heavy for the first set, super, super light for the second. Not necessarily even like sets, like set 1, set 2, set 3. I just mean like from the first sort of half to the second half, right? You could call that all one set, but they call it a contrast set in other certifications. We don't necessarily call it that. We don't call it, NASM just calls it a power superset. But ask any of the other certifications, they call it a contrast set. And what you're doing is you are training your muscles in both sides of that equation I mentioned earlier. You're training for the high force and you're training for the high velocity. So that's going to shift your entire force velocity curve a little bit. Because if you have too much force, and that'll sometimes slow your velocity down. And so like it's like, oh, okay, well, if I want to increase my power output, think of it in terms of like a rocket, right? Or like if you were you're like, oh, well, I'm going to load a bunch of gunpowder in here and that'll make a even more explosive rocket. And it's like, yeah, but the problem is now you're making the rocket heavier. So it won't be able to like propel itself as much as it's supposed to, right? This isn't one big explosion. It's like, you load a lot of fuel in there. Well, now it's heavier. You're losing fuel efficiency, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, okay, well, now I'll just make the rocket lighter. It's like, well, you can't just do that either, because now, if you're trying to make it lighter, it might not have enough fuel, or maybe it won't be able to, it'll have too much air drag and it'll get pulled around and pushed around by the air.
Has to be
So it's like, what's that?
Has to be like proportionate.
Yeah, it's got to be just the right amount of one and just the right amount of the other to meet this like perfect middle, gives you a whole new amount of respect for freaking NASA and Elon Musk, right? Like
that's crazy, bro. Homie,
yeah,
they made it to the moon what, like 50 years ago before they could even.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? Yeah,
They're all with numbers.
Yeah, I think about it all the time.
Yeah.
Did you ever see the movie? Did you guys ever see Hidden Figures? It's a movie.
No. Let me write this down.
So it's about these women who basically were responsible for getting us to the moon. They did all the math. But I'm looking at the book. That's actually not the book I meant, not the book Hidden Figures. I'm looking for so there is a picture on the internet of the woman that this movie is based on.
Yeah.
And she is holding the code that she wrote for the space shuttle.
Wow.
And it looks like it's crazy. It's a book that's about this thick.
Oh yeah.
And it's all the code for the freaking space shuttle. And it's like they used to have to hand write that. I mean, like this didn't have, they had computers, but like not the way we have computers today. Crazy. Yeah. So cool. Anyway, I'm totally distracted. So Eddie, answering your question, you got to have this like perfect middle ground. So the way NASM addresses that is they do contrast sets rather than trying to get you to train perfectly in the middle, which would be very difficult to calculate. Instead, you do a set heavy and then you do a set that's super light and super explosive. And so you're training for high force and high velocity, and that increases your power output. And that's why we do that.
Is it kind of like drop sets or no?
It is exactly like a drop set.
A drastic one, huh? A drastic drop set. Like maybe like a 50 and then like a 20. So
you do 85 to 100% of your 1 rep max for the first part, and then normally a drop set you would drop by 10-20%.
Okay.
But in this version, you drop all the way down to about 30 to 45% of your 1 rep max. So you're doing like you're doing like
from 100 to 30.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. Go from like, I mean, you literally could do that. That would be the most extreme version, which probably actually wouldn't get you the best results because there just wouldn't be enough time under tension. So I'd say like go from 85 to 30 or 85 to 45. And that way you can do about 5 reps at about 85.
Yeah.
And then you can pair that up with about 10 reps at 30 to 45.
So like, let's say like a French press, right? A French press at the one. Pick up like an 80, do it 10 times, and then pick up like a 45, and then.
Sure. Or yes. Yeah. I wouldn't do this with a French press. Just because one of the other rules, totally separate from what we're talking about here. You never do this with single joint actions.
All right.
And a French press is just your triceps all by themselves.
Yeah.
So I would say do this with like a bench press and a medicine ball chest pass.
Okay.
Or a squat and a squat jump, or a
All
deadlift
right.
and a kettlebell swing, you know?
All right. That's cool.
Yeah, you want to use multiple, whenever you're doing this, you want to use multiple. And the French press got, I mean, you can see this picture. Yeah, the French press got a little bit of shoulder stuff. So it's like, oh, well, arguably, but not, it's a single joint action. You're only moving
your elbows.
You know, if you were doing this, then I'd say, sure, go for it.
What is that one? Like a tricep extension kind of pullover. If you're
like with a pullover. If you did with like a pullover, like if I did like, if you did like a heavy dumbbell pullover and then you had like a cable and you did like wham, super explosive, or I wouldn't do it with a cable because it'll jump, but resistance band.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you can do that version.
Oh wow. All right.
But yeah, we don't do this for single joint. We'll talk more about that in program design classes. But yeah, we don't do single joint power stuff just because think about how number one, and this is the least important, but think about how silly it looks too. If I did this. It's not the best use of my time.
Yeah, right. Okay. All right. I heard you.
Okay, so shifting gears, we are gonna tiptoe along the math line here, because I'm not the best math teacher. So luckily I don't have to be because we're not gonna do too much of it. So we are gonna look at arthrokinematics. Remember that word we used I want to say on Thursday last week? Arthrokinematics, joint motion, right? It is how our joints move around. So if we were looking at this mathematically and we were trying to like calculate out, because we do know that like, you know, if I had this ball here, the amount of force that it's applying, how much it feels like it's applying is going to be very different if I'm doing this with my little bent joints versus this with my straight joints. And there is some big fancy math that we could do to actually figure this out. Luckily, we don't have to do that, but we do have to understand the concept of where it is and sort of how it's working in the background. So this is where we got to sort of label these things out. And here's one thing I got to apologize for. Certain people out there use different sort of shortened, they use different vocabulary when they're teaching this stuff. These letters, which make it a lot easier, are sometimes inconsistent. In fact, from your NASM to your trail guide, they're going to use slightly different letters to abbreviate these things. And it gets kind of confusing when you're trying to be like, which one's which. But remember the long versions without the abbreviations, and that problem sort of goes away. So your bones act as levers, right? And so a lever is like a big long rod that's going to be manipulated by something else, right? That's what a lever is. So if your bone is that lever. So you think about, again, like I've got my humerus here, right? And I got my deltoid muscle that runs down and it grabs about, not halfway, but I don't know, maybe the top third of my humerus. So when it pulls, it's going to manipulate the rod that is my humerus. It's going to manipulate that bone, right? Or if you grabbed a broomstick with your, you had it in your hand and you were doing this, the broomstick would be swinging around, right? You'd be manipulating the lever. Your joint is what we refer to as an axis most of the time, although sometimes people will call it a fulcrum. Again, this is where vocabulary is annoying, but I like the term axis. And it's the axis where your two bones are actually being manipulated, right? So if two bones are coming together like this, the point where my two fingers are meeting, that's the joint between the two, that's the axis or the fulcrum. Okay, so levers are manipulating about a fulcrum, right? Or they are manipulating about an axis, which I like the term axis, but whatever. And then you've got your muscles. Your muscles are applying the effort. Okay, your muscles are applying force. That they're generating their own internal tension. That's going to move the lever about its axis. And remember, we talked about all the different types of joints that we have, right? We got hinge joints. Well, the muscles are moving them, allowing the axis to hinge. But we've also got pivot joints, right? Those are the ones that make the rotational movements, and they move about this type of axis. And then we've got like a gliding action, which sort of pushes it back and forth along like a gliding, right? Those are sort of the three types of movements. Well, we're also going to see three different types of levers. And then lastly, sort of opposite of your muscles, you have a resistive force. You have a resistance that's sort of working in the opposite direction here. So this is where we have these different classes of what we call levers in our body, okay? So in the body, your bones are representing the lever, your joint is representing the axis, and your muscles are applying the force against a resistance force, a resistive force, which is usually gravity. Although it could be like the tension on like a resistance band or the tension in the water, you know, it could be other things, but usually it's gravity. So three main types of levers, right? And this is what they're going to kind of look like. This is how your body is arranged. So you've
Kind of
got
like this.
What's that?
Kind of like this. Wait, hold up. Damn, this thing is too bright. Wait.
Oh, he's doing a back lever.
Oh, wait, a front lever.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, yeah. His
That-
body is the whole lever, and that's why they call it a back lever.
That's actually me right there.
That's you.
I can't,
Yeah,
You can do a back lever. Oh,
a back lever and a front lever.
you're gonna
Yeah.
show me tomorrow,
that's
dog.
impressive.
Right there, look. There you go.
That's a front lever. That's really impressive. I
Oh,
find
you're
it
holding yourself on the pull-up bar with your body straight, huh?
Yeah, so you're using your lats and you're contracting your abs and you're squeezing your butt. You're using the whole body as a whole unit, and you just stay there and you hold your breath. Well, not hold it, but you kind of have to like have like a deep breath to do it, to hold it
Yeah.
for a couple seconds. Cause like,
I imagine if you do that, can you do a flag too?
you know what? I was actually practicing the other day. I'm trying to learn that. So I was practicing that what was it? I think it was Saturday.
Yeah.
So yeah, watch, I'll show you right now. So let's see.
Oh, not
So that's
bad.
me. Yeah, so I was starting off with like some drills. So like I would literally start off like coming up first,
Oh man.
That is impressive.
and then I try to work my way back down, trying to keep it centered, but it's hard. You gotta do a lot of oblique works for that.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult, man.
Oh,
I'm trying.
no.
Hey, I could show you an oblique exercise you probably never seen. I'll show you tomorrow.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, definitely.
That's
Anything that will help me
acrobatic.
strengthen that side, for sure.
Yeah, that's like some acrobatics right there, huh? That's like what they do in the, what do they call it? The circus? And they give to the fighters.
The gymnastics.
Gymnastics, yeah.
Gymnastics, so,
Yeah.
Yeah. Easy, bro. That's crazy. Good
But this
job.
is street, so they call it calisthenics.
right.
Mm,
Yeah. That kind of reminded me of that when you said levers. I'm like, levers, levers, levers.
huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's right, homie.
That's awesome. Thomas, did you say, I heard you chime in for just a second. Did you say,
Oh no, I could do the flag.
I could do the flag.
Mhm.
Oh.
Sick, bro.
man,
I'm working on
I'm
that,
supposed to
man.
be teaching you guys how to do stuff. You guys, I can't do any of this.
Takes a lot of grip strength too, though, huh?
Seriously.
Yeah, it's a push and pull movement.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
I
So you
was
gotta
just
push
about
it from
to
the
say that.
bottom, and then you
Yeah.
gotta pull it from the top, and then you
Correct.
gotta have like some strength on your obliques too, to have
Yeah.
it there. Yeah.
You see, by the time I'll get my body in that position, man, my hands will cramp so bad I gotta let go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it takes a lot of practice. Like,
Yeah.
So
I
this
think
is
there was a
another
point.
one.
Oh, my bad. Oh, the planche. Oh, that's hard, bro.
Yeah. So this is, yeah, they call this the planche. Now, here's why it's so hard. This is looking at levers. This is why it's so difficult. Notice the reason they have to put their hands so far back is because like now gravity is pressing here in the middle rather than like nobody could do a planche if their arm was like 90 degrees. You know, like if their arm was out like this, no one could do that. I doubt there's a person on the planet, right? But the reason this exercise is so difficult, look at how long this lever is, and all these muscles have to work to pull
Together.
this way. Resistance is pulling directly down this way, and all these muscles have to pull up this way.
It's a lot of shoulder work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is what we're looking at when we're looking at levers. Okay. So there's gonna be three main types. And that's why they call it a front lever, by the way. And that's why they call it a back lever. They call it that because it's named after, you know, whoever was a kinesiologist was like, well, name it after, you know, this thing that I spent thousands of dollars learning. So this is what we call a first class lever. When you think of a seesaw, that's actually a first class lever. It's where the axis is in the center of the bar, or, you know, somewhat towards the center, right? And so now if effort's applied this way, what's that going to do? That's going to raise this way. And if effort's applied this way, it's going to raise this way, the seesaw, right? Your spine is a great example of a first class lever, right? Like my resistance is dead center and then it pulls this way and then it pulls this way, right? Like if I'm doing this, seesawing, right? Basically there's a balance in the middle. The axis is the dead center there. Or you can think of here, right? Like this is actually also a first class lever. It doesn't really quite look like it because it's like it's so far towards one side, but he's applying resistance here to raise the opposite side, okay? Second, yeah, so there's your neck. That's a classic example there. Or we were talking about the French press earlier, right? Really similar. That is a good example. Your triceps are a really good example of a first class lever. Because the way your triceps work is they wrap down your arm and they come around your elbow and they grab here. So your elbow is representing that little axis in the middle of the seesaw. And that's why they can produce a certain amount of force. Now there's also second class levers. Second class levers are kind of like the wheelbarrow. And this is actually where the axis is the very end of the arc there. And there's really not a lot of these in your body. There's not a ton of examples here, but the classic example is actually your gastrocnemius, your foot here, right? It looks like a wheelbarrow if you think about it, right? When you do like a toe press or calf press or whatever, right? It runs down, and when it pulls, it basically is pushing effort this way. The resistive force is sort of in the middle, and the axis is the very end there. Like I said, there really isn't a lot of these in your body. It's just your calves are kind of the best example. And then we got third class levers. Okay, third class levers are the most common inside of your body. This is where you can see there's sort of a pivot point in the middle. So the effort is actually being applied. God dang it, it's too zoomed in here. You can see the effort is being applied here in the middle of the lever, in the middle of the bar. And so then it pivots around. So it's like, and picture this, like, do you guys remember being in Little League, or maybe played high school baseball, right? If you're trying to sometimes increase your bat, when I was a kid, I bought a bat that was way too big for me. My parents and I didn't listen to our coach, and he was like, here's the bat you want to go buy. And we didn't listen. And so mine was way too big especially for like little skinny me. It was a bad situation. And so my coach would always be like, look, you're never gonna be able to swing that bat. You got to choke up. So I would like leave this much, like I'd be choked up like way up here, and there'd be like this much bat behind. And it would always like hit me in the arm when I'd swing through. Like I'd walk home with these like bruises and stuff. But what choking up did for me is it gave me an advantage for how much force I could produce. And that's why there's so many of these in our body. We have a lot of these. Our body's very efficiently designed. So you'll see like the effort's being applied in the middle of the bar. But look at this one. If he takes it all the way down here, it's going to feel like nothing. And that's why choking up helps us so much. When you take the effort arm and you move it nearer to the resistance, the closer your effort is to the resistive force that you're working against, the easier it's going to feel, because there is way less torque. And torque is the amount of pressure that you feel based on something. So if I got my spoon here, right? If I'm holding it at the very end like this, there's a ton of torque here because the resistance is really far away. But if I go like this, there's hardly any. This is going to be way easy. In fact, I mean, this is a very light thing, but like I don't have a good grip here. This feels heavy. I
can actually feel it because I've done that,
Yeah.
Impressive.
Exactly, right? Yeah. So imagine, right? And this is why we got to look at how our exercises are designed. If I've got a dumbbell in my hands like this, and I'm doing this, this is going to feel really hard. But if I had it here, it's going to feel a lot easier because my resistance went from being way over here to being so much closer to my axis. My axis is my shoulder joint. And this is actually why, which is what leads me to saying why I have such a hard time with calisthenics. I got long levers. I'm a long, like skinny, long arms. It has been a lifelong struggle for me to get better at bodyweight exercises. I'm so bad at bodyweight. And honestly,
you feel heavier, huh? With your
What's
body,
that?
with your type of body, you feel a lot heavier because you have like long.
Because it's a lot more torque. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing with all of weightlifting. You know, think about how you look at like somebody who's maybe like 5 foot nothing, how far they have to go during a bench, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Not as much distance. And so they have less torque, right? And that's the thing. That's what like one thing. So now it's like, oh, okay, let's say I've got a client. I work at a gym that for some reason, you know, it goes from 10-pound dumbbells straight to 15. There's no 12 and a halves, right? Like they don't have those at my gym. And I got a client who's getting better at shoulder raises. And they're like, these 10s are not hard enough anymore. I feel so much stronger. And I'm like, that's awesome. Let's make it harder. Right. We give them the 15s and they're like,
oh.
They can't do it. Right. Like 15 is too much. It's like, I need 12 and a halves. Well, why don't we do this instead? I give them 20 pounders, but then instead we have them do this version of a lateral raise. And like now they can lift a little bit heavy and it's like, oh, well, I'm way stronger. It's like, well, this is a different exercise entirely. But this is going to be what fills in our gap. And when you get stronger at this, we can work from 20 to 25. And that might get you to the 15s when we go back to our long, high torque version in a moment. And this is the math part, right? Like this is like there is some big fancy math associated with all of this. You look, it's like how many inches times this divided by, it's dumb. But luckily we don't have to do that necessarily. But this is where, you know, you can see, right? Again, this is an example of like a third class lever right here. Your bicep runs down and grabs this bone. It's actually not very far down. You know, it could be, you know, it would be a lot stronger if it could actually go this way and insert all the way down here, but then it would also be very awkward and wouldn't fit our body very well. So you can see though, like this is a third class lever. The axis is way over here. And this is the kind of, you know, choking up a little bit to give us an advantage. And that's also why, like, generally you can lift a little bit more weight with your biceps than you can with your triceps most of the time. Not everybody's like that, but usually. It has what is called mechanical advantage, which just means that like it has a much more advantageous design to make it stronger compared with, you know, something else. This is also why, like, you know, think about how much you can do on like a leg press. You're using your glutes and your quads, these huge muscles, but like look at that in comparison to using the leg press for calf presses. It's still, you have a lot of weight on there, you know, for those little tiny calf muscles. They're just a much more, the reason they're able to do that is because they have more mechanical advantage. The way they're designed is closer to the axis. So it's just easier for it to lift a heavier amount of weight, even though it's a smaller muscle.
Yeah.
But like I said, luckily, I'm not going to make us do math. Thank God. Because if you learn math from me, you guys would be screwed. You guys would be in trouble if I got to teach you math.
I mean, eventually we'll probably move on to that once we start like learning how to calculate macros and all that stuff.
That kind of math, that's basic math. I can do that. Not super well, but yes, I will teach you how to do your macros. But and there will be mistakes, but you will get it. That'll be your guys's second to last mod, actually. So rotary motion. So rotary motion, very similar. By the way, rotary motion is still going to be part of this. It's just movement around an axis, but like it's the turning effect. So like rotary motion is kind of interesting because it's like it's going this way instead of like directly like shortening things. It's spinning things, right? And then another term you're going to see is, like I said, torque. Torque is what creates rotary motion. You know, even if I'm doing this, this is still kind of drawing a circle, right? So the closer a weight is to the joint, the less torque it's going to create, and the farther a joint is away from its. I'm sorry, the farther the weight is away from the joint, the heavier it's going to feel. So here's the example of that. And this is the basic math version of what we're talking about here. So let's say you're holding a dumbbell straight out of your arm side, right? The weight is, we're saying approximately 24 inches away from the shoulder joint. So if you were to measure, take a tape measure from here to here, we're going to say this is 24 inches, right? It's exactly 2 feet. So my deltoid muscle, right, which is running over top here, is approximately 2 inches from the center. So it was 24 inches, but this is 2 inches long. So that's going to be 22 inches. Okay. That's 11 times greater than the distance it's covering. So if I move the weight closer by bending the elbow joint, now the weight is here. If you were to measure how far away that is from my deltoid muscle, it's only about 12 inches away, 24 inches away, 12 inches away. The deltoid muscle is still 2 inches long. So now it's only a difference of 10 inches overall. 12 minus 10, or 12 minus 2, we get 10. So now it's only 5 times greater. This has less torque than this. And that's the background math behind what this is doing. This is why, no matter how strong you guys are, Thomas, I know you're very strong, Mir, and you guys are we're all athletes in here, right?
I don't know. I think Eddie got me beat with all those calisthenics.
Good Lord, right? Yeah, we got somebody who can do a flag, and we got lever guys over here.
Nah, I'm sure you can lift heavier than me though, man. Because I mean, I do a little bit of both, but I'm sure like you're super stronger on bench pressing, because that's like my weakness right there.
Nah, me too, bro. If I don't do it every other day, it goes away.
Yeah.
Here's the thing, though, right?
We need to take Eddie to juvenile hall so he could teach these kids how
Oh my God.
punch each other in the face. They could just hang around, you know.
For the record, I think that's a great idea. Let's churn out some more personal trainers, get some kids inspired.
Yeah.
But you could be freaking all-star athletes, you know, power lifters, you know, doing a bent over row for 300 pounds. And then you go into the gym, you go to the cable machine, and you do a reverse cable cross, right?
Oh, yeah.
You're pulling this way. And you're doing like what, 8 pounds? Like, you know, and it's just because this is as long as it gets. And this little muscle back here, it's about that long. Yeah. So like I've taken big burly, and you know, we're trying to get you to pinch your shoulder blades back, right? We're trying to get this like ideal posture here. So we got to strengthen those, you know, muscles that are pinching in the back, those middle trapezius, but it's not long, it's not a big muscle. So I'll take these big burly guys, they're like you know, rowing hundreds of pounds, and I put, you know, 5, and they're like 5, and I'm like, trust me, man, like 5 is enough. And they're like, like,
yeah,
it's why, you know, I can fly, you know, 40 pounds on it, and then I do a reverse fly and it's like little 10s, you know. Like, it's a difference. There's a difference in the length of the muscle versus how long the lever is. And that's torque in a nutshell. And it's great knowing about this, because there's going to be times when you're working with your clients and you're just like, I got to make this harder, but I don't have any dumbbells available. Oh, I'll just increase the torque. And it's like, hey, I want you to hold it this way now. And they're like, ah. And there you go. It's also why one of my favorite ab exercises is the long lever crunch. Love this exercise. And it's literally like any other sit-up. You just take your arms over your head because you're pivoting at the spine. So by doing that, now you've got weight further away from your axis, and it just feels much, much, much harder. Okay.
I like, yeah, you know, how I obtained the front lever is by doing the dragon flags, actually. You know, the one where the Rocky does that shit, or Bruce Lee. Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's my favorite exercise, bro. Like I remember practicing that shit, and it definitely helped out with learning that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Oh man, I love Rocky IV so much. It's the greatest training montage in movie history.
Can't understand that man, bro, when he talks.
Right? Yeah. You know why that is? He when he was being delivered as a baby, they used to, I don't know if they even still use these anymore, but they used the thing they call forceps. And it was like a little, you know, like it was like honestly like it's like tongs for babies.
Oh man.
Like, you know, what you cook with, right? Like, and so they went in and they grabbed him to pull him out. And it clipped a muscle in his jaw.
Oh, man, poor kid.
Yeah, and it killed this muscle here, so he has no, the nerve is severed, so he can't talk. It's not where he's from, it's not his accent or anything, it's literally he's missing a muscle here, or he's missing a nerve. If there is something to know about, if there's trivia you guys ever want to know about Rocky or Sylvester Stallone, I know all of it.
He's Italian, right?
What's that?
He's Italian.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Oh.
That guy inspired me to do a lot of crazy stuff, man.
I love the Rocky series so much. Read, guys, look it up. We don't have time. If I get into this, I won't stop for an hour. But like, look up the story of Rocky. It's insane. He was literally practically homeless. Hollywood offered him more money than had ever been offered for a Hollywood script in history for the script to Rocky, because he wrote it, right? And he said, he was like, okay, that's great, but I want to star in it. And they were like, you can't talk, so no. And he was like, well, then you can't have my script. He was literally almost homeless, and he stuck to his guns and was like, I will only do this if I get to star in it.
And then he was out there with the guns in the jungles and everything that, you know what I'm saying?
Right?
He kept them. That's right.
All right.
That's crazy.
There's more to that story. It's incredible. Yeah. Look it up. Look it up. Watch him tell it. He's got interviews about it. It's incredible. Okay. So last concept of the day. Moving on to our final little bit here. So we got to talk a little bit about what we call motor behavior. Motor behavior is your brain muscle connection. It's how we learn all of our stuff, you know? So it's how our kinetic chain is able to start to create a movement, but also learn from it and get better in the. When you think of, like, when you hear people say muscle memory, that's kind of what they're describing. They're describing your overall sort of motor behavior. So motor behavior is all of it, right? And there's sort of three components that kind of make this up. There's motor control, which is how your nervous system takes in information and, you know, uses that information to execute the appropriate responses. Your stretch reflex I mentioned earlier, right? That stretch shortening cycle, that's an example of motor control. It's like, whoa, we stretched out this muscle, we should contract that, you know, so it doesn't get over lengthened. There's also motor learning, which is like you doing this consistently over time and getting better at it. And then there's motor development, which is that over like the course of your life. So it's like, you know, what I always like to ask people is sort of a trick question, but like, do you guys think walking is hard?
Not anymore.
Exactly. That's the perfect answer. Yeah, not anymore. Right. But like, you know, if you look at it, I would actually, I mean, you're right on, right? It's like, I don't feel like it's hard anymore. I was like, well, I would argue that walking is harder now as an adult than it was when you were a baby. And that sounds kind of weird to say, but what I mean is, like, a baby doesn't weigh as much as an adult.
Oh yeah.
So like, isn't it like gravity? That makes it harder. But the thing is, you're exceptionally good at it. You're really good at it. So it doesn't feel hard to you anymore. Nothing in this world ever gets easier. We just get really good at it, you know? And that is motor development. It's like your change over time. By the way, that's one of my favorite motivational quotes that I have totally co-opted for muscles. It's supposed to be a motivational thing, which I do love, but I use it to talk about muscles. But it's like, nothing gets easier. We just get good at it, you know? And so like, we slowly change over time. We slowly develop our body, right? And we learn how to use these muscles together. It's like, oh, well, I tried to use this. It's like, now I'm going to use this to kind of recruit it. That's where, you know, knowing about your muscle synergies, right? These groups that are coming together, these force couples, right? Over time, your body gets better at recruiting them the way they're supposed to be recruited. It's like your quads, hamstrings, and glutes during a squat. Your glute is supposed to be the star of the show. But sometimes the quads and the hamstrings take over. So we need to train the body to do synergies properly. So we can do that in a variety of ways. Oftentimes, you know, our favorite technique is to simply get the glute turned on by doing an isolation glute movement for a couple reps just before we go do our squats. It's like, hey, give me a couple kickbacks, get the muscle activated. Now let's go do your squats. And now your nervous system is all fired up to use your squats. It's like, oh, great. And it's going to do the thing that it's kind of already been trained to do for the day. Like, you people will do clamshells or like abductions or kickbacks, and then they'll go do their leg workout for the day. We call this, in our side of NASM's approach to this, we call it the movement prep section. And you'll see that actually listed on a blank OPT template. We'll have our warm-up section where we turn off the tight stuff. And then this is the movement prep section for core, which we always want turned on. And then we use a little bit of balance. We use a little bit of reactive techniques to get the right muscles turned on. Then we can dive into leg day or chest day or back day or whatever it happens to be, you know?
Yeah.
And like I said, we're going to come back to that in actual program design classes. But so again, we see the word proprioception here. This is just another word, this vocabulary term, which we already know is back again. But obviously, this is a big part of motor development and motor learning, right? If you don't have like information coming in properly, you're never going to be able to learn, right? So again, this is the cumulative neural input from sensory afferents. Most complicated definition ever. It's your body's spatial awareness. That's proprioception. And so through core training and balance training in particular, we're enhancing proprioception. We're getting those muscles turned on. That's why we start with core balance, right? That's why it's movement prep. You're enhancing proprioception before you get to the real gym floor, you know? It's not the warm-up, but it's also not the workout. It's the post warm-up pre-workout section. It's like we warm up by turning off all the tight stuff. We turn all the weak stuff on. Now it's turned on. Let's go hit the gym, you know?
Yeah.
So we enhance our proprioception. We do a lot of balance and stuff to kind of make that happen. And that gives us what's also another kind of big term here that you'll sometimes see, which is called sensory motor integration, which is your nervous system basically taking that information and integrating it to actually move you around, right? So you're not going to see this term too often, but it's basically like information comes in and your body chooses which response is most appropriate. Now, that, based on what I just said, is only ever going to be as good as the information coming in, which is why we have this really important term here, right? The information is only ever going to be as effective as the information coming in, which means you need to send the right information in, right? Which is why it's so important for us to make sure that we don't let our clients get away with bad form. We let them get away with that, they're going to have bad sensory motor integration. They're going to go, oh, it's supposed to feel this way. And then their nervous system is going to get trained up to do it that way. It's going to learn how to do it wrong. This is, again, why like we actually, you know, I talked about this last week where I was talking about like dress shoes, right? They put you into an elevation. They're like wearing high heels. So now your calf muscles are getting signals all day saying, yeah, no, this is our resting position, when in fact, this is the resting position. So they get used to it. It's only ever going to be as good as the information coming in, right? So when it comes to motor learning through practice and experience and, you know, making these changes over the course of our lifetime, it's really important for us to give our clients the right feedback, choose the right exercises, and make sure that we don't let them train with bad form. This is not actually in your PowerPoint, but I put this note here because one of the things that we talk about in all of our program design classes is this principle that NASM is super obsessed with, and so am I. And it's called the Principle of Specificity. And it states that the body will experience specific adaptations to whatever the imposed demands are. Remember how we mentioned function follows form, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Stuff has to be shaped a certain way so that it can act a certain way. If I got a client who says, I want to get better, I want to be able to do 100 push-ups in a row. Okay, great. Should I make them do the bench press? No, I should make them do push-ups. They're going to get better at the bench press if they do the bench press. They're going to get better at push-ups if they do push-ups. Like, it's actually quite simple when you lay it out, but we have to say it because sometimes it's easy to forget. You know, it's like the body will specifically adapt to whatever you impose upon it. So if you want to get, you know, better at exercise, you need to exercise the right way. You do it the wrong way, you're going to get better at being really good at something that's close to the right way to do it, right? Rather than getting good at what we're trying to get good at. This is why good form is so vital.
Like recently on the weekend, not only I was working on the human flag, but I'm also learning the muscle up. But like the muscle up is kind of tricky though, because a lot of people tend to do it with a sloppy form, like they'll chicken wing it, which is bad, and you'll get injured. You'll mess up your shoulder that way. And also you can mess up your wrist if you don't, you know, have it nice and stable, because it's like a weird transition. Like you gotta
Yeah.
go
Being
like
able to go
that.
from here to
and
here
you
is
could- yeah, and you could easily like, sprain your wrist or something like that. And also the kipping part of the thing like also helps.
Yeah.
But I've also I want to learn like I want to strengthen my upper body for it so that way I could do it effortless. And by
Yeah.
doing that, I was using the resistant band for that just to kind of have my form aligned the whole
100%.
time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then that also fixes my form too.
Yeah.
But I remember you mentioned that using the bands are not like as effective, right? At first or whatever, or you trying to at least
just
like
for bone
do it.
density.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's really good for correcting forms and certain exercises. And then once like, you feel like you need less resistance, which is like in the process what I'm doing. So
Hey, make no mistake, guys. I love bands and I use them literally every day. Just from the perspective of bone density, if you have a client with osteoporosis, don't strictly do resistance band workouts. Try to get some dumbbells in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. All right, so our last little bit of the day, if we're talking about this whole sensory motor integration, right? We're trying to be as specific as possible, trying to get our clients to move the way they really are intended, right? Well, we got to use feedback. When we're coaching our clients, this is the feedback you're going to give them. And the feedback, by the way, isn't just what you're saying, it's also what they're feeling and experiencing, okay? Like right now, like the temperature of my room, I'm getting feedback, right? So it's the use of sensory information and sensory motor integration. So like what they are feeling as they're doing the movement to help them move the way they're supposed to. There's going to be two parts of it. There's internal and external. Internal feedback is the feeling stuff, right? Internal feedback is the process where the body is reactively monitoring to whatever is going on. Okay, so your body is like, oh, that's interesting. This feels a little bit different. Like if you're standing on one leg, for instance, right? I can feel like muscles over here are shortened and muscles over here are lengthened. But if I go back to here, right, now it all feels very different. It's like, oh, well, all that force just moved down to the bottom of my foot now. My body's just kind of feeling all this in real time, consistently and constantly. And that's all the internal stuff, right? Your body kind of feeling it out. Then you have the external feedback, which is like if I'm looking at a mirror and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not as straight as I thought I was, right? That's external feedback. Or if a trainer is like, hey, chest up, and you're like, oh, I guess, yeah, he's right. Right? Like that's external feedback, right? And we are a lot of external, so internal feedback is the information coming into the central nervous system from all those Golgi tendon organs, the joint receptors, the muscle spindles, all that information coming in, the brain sort of interpreting it, right? Internal feedback is very similar to proprioception. They are almost exactly the same thing. The only difference is like proprioception, sort of the idea of the position, and internal feedback is like sort of the ongoing process of proprioception. It's like proprioception over time is a good way to think about it. And then external feedback is like, information provided from some external source. Again, looking at a mirror is kind of a good example of that. Or like even my heart rate monitor here, I'm getting feedback about what my heart is because I actually can't sense internally how my heart feels until it, gets really elevated. Can't really feel it, So I need to use external feedback for that. Or, if a trainer's there saying like, hey, nice work, you were driving your knees out. That's external feedback. So we want our client, or, looking at the tape during a play, it's like, see how you juked here, you should have juked over here, right? That's external feedback. So there's sort of two components within the external part. We call this our knowledge of results versus our knowledge of performance. And this is used, they're slightly different, right? So knowledge of results is used after the completion of a movement to let your client know about the outcome of their performance. Literally, if you're like, up top, nice work. Hey, that looked really good. That's knowledge of results. Knowledge of performance is just slightly different. That provides information about the quality of the movement. So that's like sort of the why behind what they did, right? So knowledge of performance is like, knowledge of results is like, hey, great squat set. Knowledge of performance is like, because you drove your knees out, you kept your weight in your heels, and you had your core engaged the whole time. So now we're starting to sort of enhance how we coach our clients because now they're going to go, oh, okay, I know I did well, and I know why I did well. And then you also want to encourage your clients. So that's the external part of it that we mostly are in charge of. And then there's the internal part of it, what we want them to take control of. which is why you also want to follow up your coaching by saying things. Now, did you feel the difference between this versus that? Remember your first set, you were dumping your chest forward, but then you did a really great job of engaging your core, keeping your chest up, and like, eyes on the front of the room there. Did you feel the difference? And they're like, oh yeah. It's like, okay, I want you to feel like that second version every time you do this exercise. And then that is going to help them get better over time. That's going to give them that motor development, right? We use feedback to develop our motor behavior over time. And that's how our clients get better at stuff. Just practice and practice and practice. So that's me wrapping up today. So each system, they're all interdependent. They're all working together. They got to work together to kind of gather information about our environments to sort of execute the appropriate responses. Our body is going to use all these muscle synergies in order to do all of that. And repeated exposure, repeated practice, and then getting feedback from both internally feeling it, but also externally, through coaching and stuff. That's how we're going to get better slowly over time. And that's where, again, kinesiology, right? We're studying how we are about to study for the second half of this course. We're about to start breaking body parts down, and we're going to look at how we're designed to move. And our job is to convey that information to our clients so that they move the way they're designed to move. It's like, here's what you're doing. Here's what I want you to do. Any questions? Thomas, Eddie, Mir, you guys feeling good?
I'm okay. Yeah, thank you.
No homework
All
today?
good.
Homework tomorrow, Eddie.
Yeah, no homework today. Tomorrow we will be meeting up in person, and then there will be the test. Well, it feels like homework, but it'll be the 30 questions, homework 1 + 2.
All right.
Yeah, so we got a lot of studying to do today.
I would, but honestly, we meet up in person tomorrow, and then I'll put the day 6 live. But we'll meet up in person, and any questions. So yeah, maybe go through homeworks 1 and 2 again today. But then, God dang it. Tomorrow you'll have a list of questions you can ask me. We'll meet up in person, so it's a great chance that's why we do them on the same day. It's a great opportunity for you guys to be like, hey, I got this right. I don't know why, and I'll walk you through it for sure.
Okay.
Gotcha. So tomorrow at 9 a.m.
9 a.m. or 6 p.m. Yep.
What time you gonna go, Eddie?
Probably 9
in the morning, right? All right, cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep.
Wait, what time does it end?
Usually 11-ish.
11-ish?
Yeah, it's usually
Okay,
like
cool.
That's cool.
Oh, okay.
Should we bring something?
A little quicker. It depends on like how hard the workout portion is going through. We're gonna do, it's like sort of a half lecture, half workout tomorrow. Trying to do about an hour of both.
All right.
Sounds good, man.
I can't wait to get in the class, the gym room.
Yeah, dude, it'll be fun.
Yeah. Should we bring something?
Oh, no. We got it all. I mean, bring water if you need it. Oh, and bring your mask. We're still on mask mandate, unfortunately.
All right. Cool.
But yeah. All right, fellas.
All right. Sounds good.